We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. I'm your host, Will Hall. And Madness Radio is co-produced by the Freedom Center, which is a local Northampton, Massachusetts advocacy, support, and activism community that's run by and for people who go through extreme states, who've been labeled with mental illness, and are allies. And you can check out our website, which is freedom-center.org. We have a number of different things going on. We have some free holistic health services, which are open to the entire community, free yoga class, free acupuncture clinic. We have writing groups. We have a support group. We do this radio show. We have a lot of public speaking events, educational events. We do a lot of local activism around different issues. And the Madness Radio is also co-produced by the Icarus Project, which is a growing national network. Actually, there are some folks who are involved internationally as well with the Icarus Project, people who have gone through extreme states, been in the mental health system, dealing with psychiatric diagnoses, but don't embrace the medical view of what we're going through, are looking to creativity and spirituality and holistic health and different kinds of alternative ways. And my guest today is Krista MacKinnon, who is an early intervention family worker with the Family Outreach and Response Program. She does advocacy with families in Toronto, Canada. And the Family Outreach and Response Program, I'll just read their website description here, supports and educates families and friends during the recovery process. Their purpose is to build on the strengths and resilience of families to enhance their lives. FOR strives to work with a diverse group of families and especially with those who cannot readily access support. They are supported by the Community Resources Connections of Toronto and has government funding. And Krista, I'll read her bio. Krista is an eclectic hobbyist, passionate about art, mothering her two boys, photography, writing, knitting, and mental health recovery. At 16, she was hospitalized after experiencing mania and psychosis and was given the impression she would always have to struggle with a disorder called manic depression, now usually referred to as bipolar. Against the general messages she received about herself from doctors, society, and family, Krista decided to ignore the diagnosis, not believing any of it. Krista has lived a healthy and mostly medication-free life since, finding her own meaning in the experience of psychosis and finding alternative forms of support elsewhere for maintaining her wellness. Now she puts her heart in mental health, supporting families and understanding the many ways they can be helpful to someone they love when psychosis and mental health issues and labeling have affected the family. So thanks for joining us today, Krista.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the work that you do. It sounds like you have a very different perspective from the kind of mainstream medicalization model, and you yourself being a survivor, someone who's sensitive to the downside of psychiatry and the mental health system. But maybe you could just start us off here by telling us what happened. I read your bio, and it sounds like you were hospitalized and labeled when you were 16. What was going on for you when that happened?
I think it started when I was even younger than 16. When I was 14, I had a lot of preoccupation with death and pretty quickly moved into suicidal tendencies and self-harm and all these kinds of things. And I eventually talked to my parents and said that I was having trouble. And they sent me to my family doctor, who pretty much just said, go home and keep an eye on her. This is typical hormonal angst or something.
So when you say self-harm, you were cutting or burning or something, or what?
Yeah, I was cutting myself a lot. And I think that's really what propelled me to tell my family that I needed help, because I just got tired of hiding it.
Wow. And you were also suicidal, sounds like.
Yes. Yeah. And I was starting to, my own behavior was starting to scare me at that point. Mm-hmm. That was when I was just my first year of high school.
So the doctor just said it was hormonal and just part of life and just ignore it.
Yeah, which amazes me to this day. when I think about that. And sometimes I wonder what he could have done differently. Like, I wonder, had he steered me into the hospital system earlier, where that would have led. Like, I don't know necessarily if I don't know. But yeah, so I went home, and my parents kept an eye on me to the best of their ability. But I got very involved in just escapism, so I started doing a lot of drugs, speed and pot, and especially LSD. So
LSD.
yeah. So
we can maybe talk a little bit more about that later. But for you, it doesn't sound like it was a positive thing. It sounds like it was a pretty self-destructive period of your life.
Yeah, and it's even when I was on taking a lot of drugs, I was really having paranoid thoughts all the time, and it wasn't like this fun, living the life doing drugs. It wasn't like that. It was really awful. A lot of it was really awful. Really negative thoughts. So, but then something happened, like some sort of switch happened in me, and I realized I was doing too much. I was just feeling disoriented all the time. So I stopped doing drugs. And even in times of sobriety, I would have hallucinations, and like I'd be reading a book, and the words from the pages of the book would actually jump out at me. And so these kinds of things were happening to me a lot, even when I was not on drugs anymore. And I just thought it was real. I figured I'm not on drugs, so this is real. This is what's really happening. It never dawned on me that it was a hallucination, even, like it just was real to me.
What other kinds of things were happening? The words coming off of the book page, and what else?
Yeah, well, I started to read a lot of literature about animal cruelty, and I became a vegetarian, and then I got more involved in reading a lot of this literature, and it was I got really obsessed with food, and I started to have really paranoid thoughts about food. So it got to the point that I had to just stop eating completely, because I eventually became vegan, and then systematically I just eliminated every kind of possible food, because somehow in my mind it was all related to cruelty, and I just couldn't take a part of it. So I stopped eating, and I didn't eat at all for, I think it was about 3 days that I didn't eat. And at this point I was really, everything was happening really fast in my mind. So it was really hard to follow for someone listening to me. It was hard to follow any train of thought, because my mouth couldn't keep up with what was happening in my mind. So I was sounding very disjointed to people who were listening to me speak. My pace was probably tripled to what I'm speaking now. And
this wasn't happening because you were taking drugs. This is something that was going on after you had stopped taking the drugs.
I was completely clean at this point. At this point, I'd been off for at least 3 months or so. Like, I had completely stopped because I made the decision to stop because I was feeling so disoriented all the time. And but the disorientation kind of stuff never went away. It just didn't go away. So, but because I wasn't on drugs anymore, I just thought that was normal, I guess. Like, I didn't realize that wasn't normal.
So what happened then? So then at some point you started to get back involved with the mental health system.
Yeah, well, it got to the point that I wasn't sleeping either. I didn't need sleep, and I was convinced that because I didn't need sleep and I didn't need food, that I must be some sort of superhuman. So I had this superhuman strength, and clearly I was no ordinary human being. So I had these messages from above that I had to, go and find. I had a lot of unusual beliefs. So eventually...
Wait a second. Tell me more about your unusual beliefs. Yeah, these messages from above that, what was about a mission or some special destiny or something? Or
yeah, like I was a 16-year-old girl living in Hamilton, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half away from Toronto, which is a big city. And I had this belief that I was destined to find my deserved fame and fortune if I headed down to Toronto, where where that's where I was going to make my way as this some famous artist, musician, philosopher. I don't know.
Or maybe
exactly.
a famous mental health advocate who's on the radio or something. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, that wasn't on the radar back then.
Right.
But yeah, and I remember seeing like the silliest things when I think back now. I remember seeing Christy Brinkley on the cover of In Style magazine, and my name was Krista Binkle. My maiden name is Binkle. So when I saw her on the magazine, it's so hard to explain, but to me that wasn't really her. That was like the messages from above telling me that I need to go and find my place and go get my deserved fame.
Yeah, the idea of signs and omens and the media communicating with us, and I've definitely had those, and they're very real synchronicities on one level, and on the other level they're just completely they're just meaningless. So maybe we can talk more about that a little bit later, because
speaking of that, when I eventually got taken into hospital against my will, I remember being in the interrogation room or whatever you want to call it, and there's a camera in that room right in the top corner. And I remember looking up at the camera and thinking like that this was all part of my. They were connected to the people that were propelling me into fame, but that I was being mistreated, and it's all so hard to explain. It's so hard to explain.
No, it makes perfect sense to me. It's very resonant with my own sense of just everything being completely full of this meaning and destiny and purpose, and there's this larger plan that's unfolding, and there's all these synchronicities and coincidences and things that supposedly are random and unrelated, like a television camera or something that you see in a magazine, are really directly speaking to your own journey and your path, and they're guiding you and telling you what you need to do. And but that can get really out of hand. I mean, there's a side of that that's very mystical and very interesting. I'm like, wow, what's the truth in that? But there's a part of it that's like, whoa, this is really out of control. And when was the point that you ended up in the hospital?
Well, I was having a lot of that, finding meaning in things that other people wouldn't. So my behavior just got so bizarre to other people that I mean, I remember sitting on the ground and watching ants crawl, and then they were building ant hills, and it was like this huge metaphor for life. And I was like getting so much meaning from sitting there watching these ants. So I think that a series of accumulated behaviors that from the outside looked just ridiculous.
So you were really absorbed in watching the ant hill, and you weren't responding to the people around you, and you're just completely like just staring at this anthill and not listening to people. And
exactly. Or the opposite would be true, and if I was talking to somebody, I would be speaking so quickly and not following any kind of linear train of thought that even if I were to try and communicate with somebody else, the reality I was living in, it wouldn't transcend the barriers of my reality versus theirs, right?
Right, and sort of carried away and really excited in all the amazing discoveries that you've made and all these realizations that you have.
So I was, so I think what was at this point when I got caught, I was heading to Toronto, and I had my guitar with me, and I was like going to go find my fame. And
so you ran away from home.
Well, no, I was actually I was staying with friends at the time anyway. I was my family was on vacation, and I was staying with friends of the family who, very close friends of the family. And it wasn't really, I didn't think of it like I was running away from home. I was just like going to live my life. I wasn't running away, but I was leaving anyway. And I had every intention of connecting back with the people in my life. I wasn't running away, but
you got caught.
I got caught though, and I was quickly ushered to hospital. So.
What happened? You got caught. That you were breaking the no staring at anthills rule, or what is it that got you caught?
I think it was just, I don't know, because I was totally in my own world at that point, so I have no idea what the conversations were behind the scenes. But I think that there were just a series of people that were saying, like, what's happening with her? She's not herself. And I don't...
I see.
And I don't even... it's funny, because I remember something so vividly, but I don't even remember who it was who put me in the car and took me to the hospital.
Oh, I see. And they brought you to the hospital, and then you were admitted, and then you were forcibly admitted, or?
Yes, I was. Yeah, it was definitely against my will because I felt that I was being held captive, and I was being kidnapped, and I was being taken away from my divine purpose in life, and it was definitely not something that I wanted to go do. I really felt I was being derailed.
So you were arguing with them in the emergency, and did they actually use physical violence against you? Did they restrain you or grab you or anything?
Yeah, not. I mean, I ended up staying in the hospital for 5 weeks. So at first, I think the first day that I was admitted, I didn't really have any. There was no restraining or anything that went on, but that did happen later because I refused to take medication.
So, but when you first went in and you said, no, this is kidnapping, you're interrupting my divine destiny, how did they actually keep you there?
It's really hard for me to remember that.
Oh, okay. You were in such an out there kind of state that a lot of the memories
it's really hard
aren't
to
there.
remember. I remember them just asking me a lot of questions and just asking me so many questions.
Yeah.
And part of it, I think that they maybe wooed me a little bit, because part of it, I think in all the question asking, I felt like I started to think that maybe somehow they're connected to getting me to this, maybe this is an avenue to get to my greater path that I'm. So I think that I sort of went along with it to some extent because it wasn't a really violent admission kind of thing. I think I was like, okay, I'll see what's going on here, and I think I just went along with it the first day, but it wasn't. Nobody was telling me I was crazy at that point or anything. So I don't know. And
then you were there for about 5 weeks, and how did that go?
Yeah, I was there for 5 weeks, and I was in an adult. It's different now in Ontario. Now people generally get sent to a first episode psychosis a ward that's specific to first episode psychosis.
Really, that's very interesting because that's not a general policy in U.S. hospitals, at least not that I know of. Maybe we'll come back to that. So, but this was a while ago. You're 27 now.
I'm 27 now. Yeah. So this was 11 years ago.
So you this was before the first episode policies came in, and you ended up in just the general psych ward with the adults.
Right. Exactly.
For 5 weeks.
Yeah. And my experience in the hospital was completely traumatizing to me, and my experience in the hospital was worse than the deepest depths of any of my depressions that I've had. It was completely traumatizing to me, the experience.
Worse than the suicidality or the cutting or the not eating or any of that.
Yeah, it was definitely worse. And,
how was it traumatizing?
It was a lot of. Well, I mean, on one hand, you're experiencing this really magical thing, and you have all these fabulous beliefs about yourself, and then you're told that you're actually disabled, and you're not anything special, and you probably never will be because you're disabled, and it was really crushing to my spirit, the messages that I got from the psychiatrists and from the treatment team. And even the type of therapy, I remember having to repeat after my psychiatrist. She would list my symptoms. So she would say, I experienced delusions of grandeur. And I would have to repeat after her, I experienced delusions of grandeur. And this was supposed to create some sort of awareness in me as to, preventing another kind of episode, I suppose. But what the result of that was that I just felt completely dehumanized and that I was being pigeonholed and judged and misunderstood.
And they gave you a diagnosis of manic depression or bipolar disorder?
Right, yeah, and said that I would need to be on medication for the rest of my life, and that also being on that medication wouldn't prevent me from having another episode. So even though I would have to take this for the rest of my life, I would still have to always see a psychiatrist and always talk about my symptoms to make sure that I wasn't having any, and that I would be living this kind of parole. So that was the general message that I received from the people who were supposed to be helping me.
Wow. And then they put you on medication at this point in the hospital? And
yes, I was on a lot of different medications, and I remember putting a big fuss up because I wanted to know exactly what it was that I was taking, and I don't know if they don't get that if people don't normally ask that, but I remember it being quite a big deal, like actually getting the information of what meds I was on. Like, it wasn't that was just handed over to me. I remember having to fight for that information.
Yeah, it's in Massachusetts, here in the States, the mental health regulations for the state are that all people who receive medication are supposed to get informed consent information about those meds, and they just don't do it. They just don't do it. And in fact, I know someone who's a friend of mine at the Freedom Center. She was in a hospital. She was told to take a tranquilizer, and then she just asked, "Do I have the right to say no?" And they didn't answer her. And then she asked again, and then they held her down and injected her just for talking back. So it's a common kind of thing that happened. Were the medications helpful to you, or were they positive in any way? Or
they were awful. They were really awful, and I don't know what would have happened had I not taken the medications. Like, what did happen in my 5-week stay at the hospital was that I stopped having unusual beliefs. Whether or not that happened because of the medication or because I just came around, I don't know.
Did you start getting regular sleep and start eating food when you were in the hospital? Because that often is something that helps bring people back into this reality.
Right. Actually, that's the one thing I can say the hospital did well, was they were accommodating to my veganism.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah,
nice.
that they had a nutritionist. Well, I mean, they were trying to convince me to eat differently, but they did have a nutritionist come and speak with me who would work with me around my eating needs. But yeah, in the hospital, I had to eat. The food was just, it was different. I ate, so that was good, and I slept because they were giving me medication that made me sleep.
And so when you went in, you were pretty sleep deprived, is that right?
Yeah, well, I didn't feel tired.
You didn't feel
but
tired.
I hadn't slept in 3 days.
Right, exactly. Those usually go along with each other, not feeling tired and not sleeping for 3 days. Yeah,
I had tons of energy.
Right, exactly.
I could have gone on not sleeping. I would have been fine.
Right. So how did you get out of the we're at a pretty low point in the story here. How did you get out after 5 weeks? So what happened?
I guess they let me. I mean, I guess they thought I was
stabilized,
okay enough to be released.
Yeah.
And I did the whole weekend pass thing and day pass, and they like baby steps to getting out of hospital and reintegrating into regular life. So it was a process. It wasn't like I was just out, but I got out of the hospital and I went home with my family, who I come from this really supportive and wonderful family, and things like this generally don't happen in my family, so they didn't really know how to deal with it, and they just, I think they just followed orders in a lot of ways, and the doctors were telling them that they had to, make sure that I was taking my medication at all times, and I think that they were getting a lot of messages that they had to be really strict and controlling with me. So they were. And I really didn't want to be on the medications because I found them very dulling, and I didn't feel like myself on them. And it was really hard to live. It was really hard to learn and to read and to think and grow and feel. It was just, I hated being on them. So basically what I did was, but my family said that they would kick me out of the house if I didn't take my medication.
Wow.
I think this is all a part of the doctor's messages of how important it was, and the fear that I might go crazy again. So
right.
There's this fear that they don't want to see that happen to me again, so they're going to do everything in their power to make sure it doesn't, and even if it means forcing this medication that I really didn't want. So what I did was I was really devious about the medication, and I would have to get my blood levels taken to make sure that everything was okay with my meds. So what I would do is I wouldn't take the medication. I'd get my blood levels taken once a month, so I wouldn't take the medication for 3 weeks. And then the week before I would get my blood levels taken,
right.
I would sort of double up on my medication every day. And it would be the week from hell, so like once a month I'd have this week from hell. And it worked.
Yeah, that's a very interesting strategy. I'll have to remember that one in terms of counseling folks at the Freedom Center.
Don't encourage that.
Right.
It was awful.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's dangerous about that is that taking medications has toxic effects, but if you go up and down, that really is very hard on your system, and it can cause a lot of problems. Especially, it sounds like you were taking like mood stabilizers, like lithium or something.
Yeah, I was on lithium.
Yeah, it's a very toxic medication, and so if you are confusing the people who are monitoring you about how much is in your blood, that can be a dangerous situation. Maybe not so much if you're, young and healthy, but it's dangerous, I think, for everybody. So just for anybody who's listening to
don't
this,
do that.
this is not an advised strategy. If you need to trick your doctors and your family, there's other ways to do it that are safer to do it. So you kind of like pursued your own path with getting off the medications at least 3 weeks out of 4, and then when did things start to come together for you? When did things kind of start switching? Did your parents start taking a different point of view, or did you start getting better? Or
well, I mean, I was in those 2 years that I was, doing this craziness with the medication. I was okay. Like I was doing okay.
You did that strategy for 2 years.
I did that strategy,
and no one knew.
Nope.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. That's kind of like digging a tunnel out with a spoon in the back of the cell or something over years. That's
Yeah.
I've never heard of something like that. That's really amazing. And it seems like it worked for you. You were able to kind of keep a hold of the part of your personality that you felt was valuable and important.
Yeah. I mean, it was really awful though. Like it was really when the weeks that I would have to take the medication, it was really awful. But I'm still amazed to this day that worked. Like I don't understand how blood levels work and all of that stuff, but it just blows my mind that no one figured out.
They didn't know. They did not even. Wow, it's amazing. So
but anyway,
then what happened after you doing that for 2 years?
Well, I was 18, and I said, I mean, at that point I was going away to college pretty soon, and I told my parents what I had been doing. So I said, I'm going off my medication now, and I want you to know that I've pretty much been off it for the past 2 years. I've only been taking it just when I get my blood levels taken, so you would think I was on it, and I'm just not doing it anymore. I'm just not going to take it. So, I mean, at that point, they were like, well, she hasn't really been taking it for 2 years, I guess,
Right, they couldn't really argue with you very
Yeah,
much,
they were like, okay then. So, so then I went away to school, and since then, I've been pretty much off medication. There's just been 2 periods where I've decided to access medication as a tool to help me in times of extreme states. But for the most part, I haven't been on medication. And I like to tell I started working for a consumer survivor organization, which means that the organization that I worked for, everybody who worked there was a psychiatric survivor. So it was a mental health drop-in center and a resource center.
This is in Toronto?
In Richmond Hill,
okay.
Which is just north of Toronto. It's called the Craftsman Center. And I'd started getting a really well-rounded education on the mental health system and on psychiatry just from working there. And eventually I decided I was going to call my psychiatrist. I was going to call that woman from so long ago, And I called her, and it took me a while to get her to actually call me back. I was going through her secretary and her receptionists and all that. But eventually she called me back, and I said, I don't know if you remember me. And she said, oh, yeah, I remember you. And I said, well, I'm just calling to let you know that, I'm not on medication. And since I left the hospital, I graduated from 2 different college programs. I got married. I had a baby. I work full-time in a mental health center, and I live a really well and full life, and I'm not on medication. And I'm telling you this because I want you to think about that when you're working with young people and the kinds of messages that you send them about what their life can be. And you know what she said to me?
What did she say to you?
Frankly, Krista, it scares me that you're not on medication. You have a mental illness, and as a preventative measure, you need to be on medication. You could have an episode at any time.
Incredible. Even with all that evidence in front of her.
And without
even actually doing any kind of clinical examination of you or any kind of detailed look at what was going on with you. She would just say that to you over the phone.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
After so long.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So, I mean, at that point, I hadn't seen her, I guess it was 6 years or something like that. So it was 6 or 7 years later or something. I'm bad at math. But, yeah. And then I got off the phone and I spoke to my colleague and I said, "Can you believe she said that to me?" And my colleague laughed and she said, "Well, the same could be said for her, that an episode could happen to her anytime. So
That's
maybe
right.
she should be on medication as a
That's
preventative measure too."
That's right. That's
Like,
a good
really,
point.
You know?
Yeah, it seems like faced with someone who's basically doing fine, they can either say, "Well, you're not doing fine," or they can say, "Well, you actually never had a problem to begin with,"
Yeah.
which is you were misdiagnosed to begin with or something.
Yeah.
But I'm interesting because you work now in family advocacy work, and I'm just wondering, when you look back at the time of your life when you were suicidal and you were cutting, and then you got into a lot of different drugs, and you went to these very wild states that ultimately ended up you being hospitalized. Why do you think that happened? I mean, what was going on? And I'm wondering, because it's, you were 14, 15, 16, what kind of role was your family playing? I'm not talking about blaming your family, but understanding what role they might have played in this, or you mentioned that they're very supportive. I mean, maybe they didn't play a role, but what's your sense now looking back of why it was that you were going through that kind of period of your life?
Yeah, you know what? I really don't know why I had those extreme emotions and why I decided to get involved in doing drugs, because a lot of people, I know that a lot of people who have these extreme emotions come from a place of having experienced really hard family life or extreme poverty, and that wasn't the case with me. Like, my family was always this, like, it was this typical nuclear, like, I did the ballet classes and all that stuff as a child. I had some sexual trauma as a really young child that I don't even remember. And I don't think that that's related. I mean, when I try and think back to what could have made this happen, and I know that, I don't know, that's the only thing that happened in my life that I don't even remember happening, but that was awful because I pretty much have,
Well, the other direction to go is that maybe the sort of delusional belief that you had about your destiny, maybe that's what was really happening. And maybe this was some kind of spiritual awakening or some kind of positive mystical process that actually only kind of went bad because of the way that you got tangled up in the system. Is that one way of possibly looking? I mean, how do you still have those experiences of coincidences and a sense of destiny and meaning and purpose and your specialness and kind of like a mystical sort of connection with the universe anymore?
Yeah.
Or is that still a past thing, or is that something you have now?
That's such an interesting question, because that's what I wonder. I really wonder, like, had I not been, because I was 16 years old, I was doing very risky behaviors, right? But I wonder sometimes, had I not gotten entangled in all that hospital stuff, if I just would have figured it out, and things would have, because the hospital and all of that was so traumatic, and it infected my life, for so long. I sometimes wonder if it could have just been handled on my own, in my own way, and if things might have worked out differently. But about the, do I still have that? It's interesting because I didn't talk about this earlier, but a lot of my unusual beliefs were really highly spiritual moments and thoughts. And now I'm getting better now, but as a result of my being labeled, I noticed that it was really hard for me to embrace any kind of spirituality because it would scare me. Like, anytime I would have a spiritual experience, I'd be like, I'm having delusions, or it really robbed me of my spirituality and my faith.
Because when you talk about spiritual experience, you don't mean, picking up a Bible or going to a church. You're talking about having an actual encounter with, like, with God, like a real mystical experience, and that might remind you of how terrible all that went wrong before.
Exactly.
So it feels scary. So where are you with that now? I mean, are you starting to open up more to that? And
Yeah, I am. I'm slowly and cautiously opening myself more up to that, and I'm kind of resentful that I have to be so slow and cautious about it.
Yeah,
But
it's funny. It reminds me a lot of my own story. Not to sidetrack, but that's one of the reasons I ended up in Northampton, because I was really off the deep end with spiritual stuff. I've talked a little bit about this on the radio show before. In California, I just really went off the deep end, and so Northampton has been very like a not spiritual experience for me because of like just trying to take care of myself.
Yeah.
But then you feel like you're in a prison because this is part of who you are. These are amazing mystical side of us, and it's tangled up in madness, but there's got to be some way of separating it out so it doesn't have to be about trauma and going into crisis and getting overwhelmed, but actually you can connect with that spiritual mystical reality, because it sounds like there was a lot of truth in what you were going through and what you were experiencing.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of untruth in it too, because it's easy for me to romanticize it, but...
Right, that's the danger. How do you navigate not romanticizing it, but not dismissing it either?
Yeah.
Well, how do you take care of yourself these days? I mean, you're working as a family advocate, and what kinds of things, you said you're not on medication, or you said you use it intermittently as a wellness tool. What kinds of things keep you kind of together as someone who has this side to yourself?
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of things to stay well. Like I practice yoga pretty regularly, and I write, and I'm a photographer, and I do a lot of art related hobbies. So I stay well by being connected to people too in a lot of ways.
And you have a family.
Yeah.
You have two kids?
Yeah, I have 2 young boys.
Yeah.
6 and 1.
Do you think that helps kind of keep you connected and keep you in touch with people and keep you well?
Yeah, for sure. For sure it does, because it's in some ways I can't indulge in my I can't indulge in my ruminating and
right.
Because there's stuff to be done and diapers to be changed, and in keeping busy, sometimes I think that that prevents me from slipping into. I still slip into really low places sometimes, but I think that having my family it's a real motivator for me to not slip too deep.
What do you do when you slip into those places?
I ride it out.
You write it out, just remind yourself that it's not going to last, and just stay with it. Yeah.
And I seek solace in poetry and in art and in music, but I ride it out. Because you have to. You have to ride it out.
So let's talk about the work that you do now. Tell us, what exactly is your job at the Family Outreach? What is it called again? The
Family Outreach and Response Program.
Family Outreach and Response Program. How does that work? What kinds of things do you do with people there?
This program is a service to families. If you want to relate it to my story, it would be like my parents could have called here and said, my daughter is displaying all these unusual behaviors, or my daughter's in the hospital and we don't know what to do, or so it's a service where families can come here, and we go there. We go into their homes. We offer them support wherever they want. If they want us to come to the hospital with them, we can do that. And it's a support for them, and it comes from a perspective. All the people who work here are either family members themselves of someone who's had really extreme mind states, or they're someone who's had experiences like that themselves. So we come from a place of, to some degree, we've been in a place similar to where you are now, and we relate to the families on a really human and personal level about what's happening for them in their family, and we try and give them as much information as we can about alternative types of treatments and all sorts of different ways you can look at what is happening, and all sorts of different ways you can find meaning in what's happening in your family, and how you can support someone who's really struggling.
So it sounds like it's very different than the kind of mainstream medical approach to these crises that most people encounter.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of approaches that, like a lot of family programs, the approaches that they take are education about mental illness. So a lot of the family support organizations run, 8 or 10-week courses that teach about the different diagnoses. Like there'll be a week on schizophrenia maybe, and then the next week will be on mood disorders, and the next week will be on medications that can be used to treat that. And so the next week might be on navigating the service system. So this is like a typical psychoeducational family group that families find themselves in when someone's experiencing unwellness in the family. So what we do is a departure from that, in that we tell families, if you want a medical education about what's happening with your relative, then these are the programs that you might be interested to go to. But if you want to look at it from just more of a human perspective and a recovery perspective and different ways of framing this, then you can come take our course, and we share with families stories of psychiatric survivors, and we share with families the things that psychiatric survivors have said that they've found helpful, and we try and get a lot of guest speakers to come in and tell their stories of recovery and things like that, so that families have a real practical understanding of the complex human emotions involved in madness and mental health labeling and all this type of thing.
So does it help the families and the people who are going through distress? I mean, how does this actually serve folks?
I think that a lot of families say that it shifts something for them. A lot of families will, after they come to our courses or our education nights or the peer support nights, they'll say that coming here helps them to really listen to their relative, and it helps them to see their relative as going through like a complicated human process, and it takes, for a lot of people, they say that they feel less afraid of what's happening in their family when they come to this course or when they come speak with us here. I think that a big part of it is hope, so they see that recovery is possible and common, and it happens in all different types of people in all different ways, and there's all sorts of paths to recovery, and some are short and some are long, but there's talk about recovery, and it's not so focused on these are symptoms and this is what you can expect, and it's more hopeful and open than that. So what families get from that is a sense of future that I think that isn't really the message that's generally given from the system.
Are people less likely to end up in the hospital or end up on medications or end up sort of promoting the labeling and the disease framework?
We do. One of the weeks we talk about language specifically, and we talk about the types of language, and we talk about how even in the family home, the types like saying, just viewing everything through a lens of the mental illness, the big bad mental illness. So, are you experiencing delusions right now? Or like using all this medical language when you're speaking with your relative, how that can be hurtful to somebody, and that somebody might not view their experiences in that same way. So we talk about, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but we talk about using different language and even the term mental illness, right? Like, who wants to be called ill? So we talk about trying to avoid using that kind of illness language in the home.
Do you guys get criticism from other organizations? Like, we have NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill in the U.S., and they take a pretty narrow perspective, and Freedom Center's actually run into quite a number of problems with one of the local NAMI chapters in the past. I know a number of people who are members of NAMI who are great, and they're connected to it because it's one of the only thing that's really around, and there are people who get good support from them. But a lot of it is very much, it's a disease, you've got to take your meds, lock them up if they get out of control kind of thing. And so do you find that you get criticized from other family groups or other people who have a different perspective on the situation?
Well, an interesting thing is happening in Ontario in that as a service system, Ontario has adopted a recovery policy. So there's actually in the systemic documents, there's this idea that we've agreed to be recovery oriented. I'm not sure how well recovery is defined, because for a lot of people, recovery, it's become this commodified word. I think that's used in the mental health system, but in some ways, because of that, we're able to do the work that we do. So, because we are all in Ontario supposed to be striving to be a recovery-oriented system, some people interpret that very differently. Some people interpret that really medically, and we don't interpret it in that way necessarily.
There's been a kind of interpretation of recovery, which means, take your meds, believe in your diagnosis, and then go to your volunteer job, and just kind of be stabilized and be out of the hospital. And that's really
you've recovered.
Yeah, it's a really kind of a twisting around I was wondering, what about a situation where the family is really the problem, when there's child abuse going on, or there's physical violence going on in the family, or the family is trapped in some kind of really crazy communication pattern where everybody's got all the parents have their own history of trauma, and then they just get really into these. I mean, I think a lot of us have the experience of our families or families that we know of just being really dysfunctional. I don't like that word so much, but there's a lot of problems that can really create what gets labeled as mental illness. And I know that it's not fashionable to really talk about the families as the problem, and I'm not blaming families, because I know that there's a lot of other factors, but a lot of times there's some pretty toxic families out there. How do you deal with those kinds of situations?
Well, I think that a lot of information is on our website about what we do, and I think that a lot of people actually find us through our website, and usually the people that find this organization are families who are really, really wanting to help. And because we talk about the kind of work that we do on the website, I think that a lot of families that are abusive just aren't interested in getting service from us to some extent, because I don't know. But
so you're already attracting the alternative kind of approach, people who are open to that sort of perspective. Yeah. So because a lot of in the U.S., people just don't have any families that don't buy into the mainstream system, don't have anywhere else to turn. There's so many times when family members come to the Freedom Center, and I wish I could just say, hey, call Krista in Toronto, Canada, but that's not really very helpful for someone in Northampton, Massachusetts.
We do have families, though, that there are definitely dynamics happening in the family home that are not healthy, and all you can do with that is keep working with the family and keep talking to the family about ways to be helpful.
Is there
hope that information sinks in and might create some shift in behavior in the home.
So there's not really a connection to family therapy or working with family systems or anything like that, or is that available to people if they're interested in it?
We do what we can, but we're a pretty small team, and in Ontario, healthcare is, we have free healthcare here, right? And counseling isn't covered, though, under our free healthcare system. So
you can't get therapy or counseling or family
right,
therapy.
So you can get all the psychiatry stuff for free. That's covered under our
the meds
universal
are free,
healthcare
but
system.
the talk is not
But
covered.
if you want therapy or family therapy, sometimes that's offered in the hospital, but then it's through this lens of medicalizing the problem. Yeah, that's usually people have to pay for that out of their own pocket.
So for family members who are listening now, and also just for anybody who's maybe struggling with these issues, what would be, because we're running quickly out of time, I'm just wondering what might be some last words, the final words of advice or message that you would want folks to think about and to be left with.
For anybody who's supporting somebody, families specifically, but anybody who's supporting somebody with mental health issues, I think that it can be incredibly powerful to focus on a person's strengths and things that they're good at, and not viewing things through this lens of disability and symptomology, and rather looking at all the things that a person can do well and looking at the struggles that a person has gone through as powerful. and helpful to them in their life.
And if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that? What do you want to say the web address of your organization?
Sure, it's FamilyMentalHealthRecovery.org.
FamilyMentalHealthRecovery.org.
Yeah.
Krista MacKinnon, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to an interview with Krista MacKinnon, who is a psychiatric survivor and family advocate with Family Outreach and Response Program in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. You can find out more information about Krista's work and the Family Outreach and Response Program by going to the website FamilyMentalHealthRecovery.org. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.